public servants. They're born with a remarkable desire to serve and protect their communities and their country. It's a calling that is ingrained in each and every one of them. Every day, law enforcement officers suit up and show up in communities all across America, not sure if they're going to return home at the end of their shifts. We recognize that law enforcement officers make sacrifices every single day to better serve their communities. But we also can't forget that sacrifice is also made by their families across this nation as well. Now more than ever, the law enforcement community needs the full support of our communities and our elected officials. Today, we're joined by Representative Abigail Spanberger from the 7th Congressional District in Virginia to discuss her tireless work on Capitol Hill in support of the men and women in law enforcement. I'm Patrick Yoes, National President of Fraternal Order Police, and this is the Blue View. Representative Spanberger, thank you for joining us today. I also want to thank you for being such a staunch supporter of law enforcement. A law enforcement officer yourself, you have a unique perspective that you bring to Congress, and very grateful of that. Could you share with our listeners a little bit about your path through life that brought you through law enforcement and then into Congress?
I'd love to. Well, thank you so much for having me on. I once upon a time was an FOP member back when I was a federal agent, but I grew up in a law enforcement house. My father was career law enforcement, began his career in local law enforcement in New Jersey before pursuing a career in federal law enforcement with the U.S. Postal Inspection Service. And my mother was a nurse. And so in our house, kind of growing up, it was, how are you going to serve your community? Or your country. And so that was sort of the lesson that I always took on. And I knew I wanted to go the country route and really followed very directly in my father's footsteps and became a postal inspector. So a 1811 federal agent with the Postal Inspection Service. I worked narcotics and money laundering cases for a time before moving from there to CIA. And out of the law enforcement realm, but certainly in that role had some work here and there with FBI agents on some joint cases. But that's my background. That's how I got there.
Well, great. This last, 18 months have been very difficult for law enforcement, from the pandemic to the unrest and then all of the, attacks on law enforcement across the country. And you've been such a strong voice for us and speaking for law enforcement. In this volatile time, how difficult it is relaying your experience to your fellow members of Congress on just the complexities of law enforcement and the roles that we play and the challenges that we face as a profession.
I think one of the interesting things, certainly I reflect back to my time as a little girl when, as a kid, you're aware when, your parent is putting on a gun and a badge and leaving the house. And I don't know that I always perceived that meant significant threat. I don't know how I always perceived that, but you're aware that that's different than perhaps other parents do it. And I think that difference is even more stark for kids who watch their parents, put on a uniform, a gun and a badge, and then leave the house. And then for me, my experience of and I mentioned the gun and the badge because it changes the dynamic of how you engage with the community when you have a gun and a badge and handcuffs. And so among the things that I have talked about with my colleagues here on Capitol Hill, community members back home, is the fact that it's a tremendous responsibility to have the legal authority to take someone's freedom or to take someone's possessions on a search warrant, an arrest warrant. And there's kind of a tremendous role and risk that comes with being in that position. And so I think that certainly over the time of the pandemic, hearing from local law enforcement, particularly from the sheriffs across the more rural communities that I represent, the challenges that we have faced with the mental health crisis. And who do you call? You call the police, you call the sheriffs. When there's a domestic circumstance, and we have seen the real, heart-wrenching reality of how dangerous those calls are when someone doesn't know what's on the other side of the door when they've arrived. And so the conversations that I've had, and certainly I'll point to Congresswoman Val Demings of Florida, who herself is career law enforcement, former police chief in Florida, and has really endeavored to talk about the fact that it is a position of responsibility to work in law enforcement at any level, and it's a calling because it changes the entire reality of how you live your day-to-day life. And certainly for those of us on Capitol Hill, our job changes the reality of how we engage at times with our neighbors, with our friends. And so there's similarities where recognizing the real challenges that face our law enforcement officers, I think is a requirement that we have.
Yeah. You look at law enforcement officers. I tell you who we are. We are ordinary people. We have families. We have the same, hopes and wishes and dreams as everyone else, but we're also called upon to do some pretty extraordinary things at times. And it takes a challenge on all of us. It really does. So I appreciate your comments there. Again, navigating through this very difficult time, I think I don't think there's anyone in law enforcement will say we get it right 100% of the time. There's a human element of what we do. But what we do have is a responsibility and a duty to find a path forward and find ways to improve the system as we go on. Unfortunately, we find ourselves at a time often in cities across this country where we're not able to have that dialogue, to have that open conversation where we're able to be part of it. And so I've always said, if we commit ourselves to a couple of things, that is that willingness to listen and willingness to arrive at a location where we can agree on and have that fact-based discussion, we can make those things happen. And that's I'm just hoping we navigate back to that point at some point, because we're taking a toll on this profession. And I'll touch on that in a little bit. But what I'd like to talk about is that you have joined Rodney Davis with a bill that is vitally important to our members. It's a matter of fairness, really. The law enforcement officers, because of the very nature of the job that we do, tend to retire at an earlier age, just because it's just the demands that are placed on individuals. And so in 1983, the laws were changed that for windfall elimination, government pension offset, that really are there's just a fairness issue. Everything we do in life is based on fairness.
Yep.
But law enforcement officers, and not just law enforcement officers, firemen, teachers,
Yep.
a wide gamut of public
servants, right?
Some 2 million public servants across this country find themselves in a position where, because they receive a public pension and go on and work in another profession where they paid their points to their quarters to be eligible for Social Security, the fact that they're public servants, they get penalized and can't collect the benefits that they, in fact, are required to pay for. So I would appreciate that, your participation in that bill, or your support of that bill, and we're hoping we can get some movement. I'd love to hear your thoughts on that bill. I mean, obviously you're co-sponsor of that bill, so it's near and dear to you. But share your views on that bill.
So this bill, and sort of aptly called Social Security Fairness, it gets it exactly, and if you'll just allow me to go into it a little bit more. So right now, there are two provisions that really unfairly reduce Social Security benefits of retired public servants, to include police officers, firefighters, federal employees, public school teachers, etc. And the one provision is called the windfall elimination provision. It reduces a public servant's retirement benefit, in some cases up to $498 per month, right? And so that's a lot of money for a career public servant who's retired. And it's money that, if they had been in another profession, would have absolutely been money that they had earned and money that's owed to them. There's another element called the government pension offset, and that reduces spouses and survivors' Social Security benefits by up to 2/3 of their monthly pension. So from a federal, state, or local government. So in the scenario where we have a widow or a widower of a career public servant, now they are seeing the money that their spouse had earned reduced significantly by up to 2/3 upon their spouse's death. And so when you think about, from the experience of a career public servant who's working, they're planning for that pension, they're planning for Social Security, they pass away expecting that their spouse is going to have the kind of the stability that they've built up, the stability that would exist if they were still alive, and to think that shift gets made upon their death is really just pretty stunning to me. And as an example, in 2020, these two provisions reduced benefits for more than 2 million retired public sector employees or their spouses. And that's about 4% of all Social Security beneficiaries. And in Virginia, where I represent the 7th District, that's about 50,000 Virginians. And so what we do with this legislation is pretty straightforward. Say this is an issue of fairness. We want to make sure that these unfair provisions are taken out, are removed, and people will get what they worked for and what was promised to them. So the exciting thing about this piece of legislation, Rodney Davis, a Republican from Illinois, I'm a Democrat from Virginia. We are leading this bill. We have been working hard, and a major thanks to our teams and also to advocates across the country who've been telling their members of Congress about this piece of legislation. We now have 260 co-sponsors, which is a tremendous amount of co-sponsors. There's only actually 17 other bills in Congress right now, and of thousands of bills that have been introduced that have more co-sponsors. So I'll speak for myself, but I'm a pretty competitive person, so we're going to keep trying to get more. But we just led a letter to House leadership saying that we want to bring this bill for a vote. We have the votes. We know when it comes. Not only do we have the co-sponsors, but we know we'll have the votes when it comes to the floor. And repealing these outdated provisions, they penalize law enforcement officers, they penalize career teachers, they penalize public servants, firefighters. It will provide immediate relief. It's really important, and it's an issue of basic fairness. So anybody who might be listening, certainly make sure that your member of Congress or your senator is aware of this effort, because that's how we continue to kind of get the excitement going on this issue.
Yeah, I mean, I couldn't agree more. You're talking about the impact it has on individuals. In reality, what you're doing is giving them the ability to help themselves with their own money. I mean, this is something they've earned. This is a benefit they've earned, and they've been denied because of rules in the IRS regulations. I'm sorry, the Social Security regulations that are just patently unfair, and we're a society built on fairness. So you mentioned the 260. I was getting ready to go there. There are enough co-sponsors to suggest that the bill has the votes now.
It only need 218 to pass.
Yeah. So why? and this is consistent. This is the highest number we've had yet. So there's definitely some momentum building here. And thank you for really taking and carrying the torch for this and being the advocate for it. But why are we having so much trouble getting a hearing? I mean, we've been above the even mark for probably 10, 15 years, but we've been unable to get a hearing. I know you mentioned you sent a letter to the speaker and the minority leader. Did you get a response from that request to have a hearing from either one of them?
We haven't, although I will caveat that that's not necessarily uncommon. With Congress does a lot of letter writing to establish things, but we have not received a response. And I'll speak very honestly, there's another piece of legislation that's moving in Congress that I think some people are paying attention to, which is a separate legislative effort. It focuses on Social Security. But there is a little bit of a narrative out there that in the bill is called Social Security 2100, that it takes care of the same issues. But indeed, it actually doesn't, because it does address this windfall provision. It does address the GPO, but only for 5 years, right? So the two provisions that I just mentioned, the windfall elimination provision and the government pension offset provision, our bill just eliminates them.
Right.
Full stop.
Right.
So full stop. This other bill eliminates them, but only for 5 years, and then they get reincorporated. And I'm not interested in doing helping. I would love to help all federal or all public sector retirees, but this is an issue of solving a problem. If it's not fair today, it's not going to be fair in 5 years.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree with you more. I have an analogy I use when I try to explain this to the layperson. It doesn't quite, because this is foreign to a lot of people. Because it doesn't affect them, they don't get it. Yeah. And they all have the same response. It just doesn't seem fair. And the analogy I have is that if I go into a grocery store along with someone who's not in the public sector and they buy a loaf of bread, they pay a full price for a loaf of bread and they leave with a loaf of bread. Yeah. But when I pay for that same loaf of bread and they find out I'm a public servant, they open it up and they take 60% of it out. So where's the fairness of that? Just because I'm a public servant, I paid for the same bread, but I'm not getting what I paid for. So,
well, and here's another analogy that I would liken it to. Let's say you work in the private sector, you work for a company, you got your 401k. Nobody at some point down the road is saying, well, you have that 401k, therefore, we're going to take these provisions, these exceptions, these changes to what happens with Social Security. Well, certainly there's been shifts in how people plan for retirement, but in a lot of public sector, public service jobs, pensions were the way of delivering that 401k, delivering that retirement. And so people would find that extraordinary that because I saved for my retirement, you're going to kind of make these exceptions and these provisions and, accuse me of having a windfall. And so it is kind of analogous to that. And that is why I'm fully supportive of our legislation. That's why I've got 260 co-sponsors, because it's such a straightforward thing that once you're aware of it, it makes sense, right? And I appreciate your advocacy. So many organizations have been doing advocacy to make sure that people are aware of this, and that's why a primary reason this other piece of legislation, it doesn't solve the problem. But to your question of sort of where's our bill versus other bills, I think this other one's getting attention because, on its surface, it solves this problem, but only for 5 years.
Right.
And so that's why we continue to make sure that people know we've got 260 co-sponsors. And frankly, there's provisions within the House. If we get to 290 co-sponsors, right, 30 people away, we actually don't need a hearing. It gets priority towards the floor. So our team, Rodney's team, we're working hard to get those last 30 co-sponsors so that we can get prioritization to get a vote on the floor. So we're rocking and rolling on that. And certainly we appreciate any of your help and advocacy in trying to, again, it's a straightforward thing. It's wholly bipartisan. And when people learn about the bill, they get on it typically. So that's what we're working to make sure more people know about it.
What we really need is we need the opportunity to have a hearing and bring real people in so they can articulate just how devastating this law is and how unpatently unfair it is. So we're committed.
That's what got me so fired up about it. If I can interrupt quickly, in 2017 or maybe early 2018, when I was campaigning, I was with a group of federal retirees, and I will never forget. We were in like a hall adjacent to a church. In the kind of community center space, and we had lines of tables, and this woman stood up and talked about her experience as a widow and what the offset has meant for her and her family, and the emotion and the experience that she's had, and the fundamental kind of feeling that her spouse had served in public service the entirety of their time together in their marriage, and then upon his passing, she's facing these provisions that just seem wholly unfair and in some ways disrespectful of his service.
Absolutely. Well, again, thank you for being such a strong advocate for this. It is one of our highest priorities. It has been for years, and I love the fact that we're seeing some movement on it, and hopefully we can finally give that relief to help out those Americans that have paid into a system and are not getting their what they're duly owed on it. So I appreciate that. You have another bill that you introduced, COPS, the BEAT grant for Programs Reauthorization and Parity Act. Could you talk a little bit about that one?
Oh, I always talk a bit about this bill. I love this bill. So, when I hear from constituents, when I hear from, and I have one sheriff a couple sheriffs in my district who are just really extraordinary in terms of sharing their experiences, particularly during the time of the pandemic and how they're responding to mental health calls, the challenges that they have in recruiting, the challenges they have in retention. Smaller localities might be losing officers to larger localities that can pay more. Just the ebb and flow and the challenges of recruiting, retaining, and having the workforce that they want. That presents them with the challenge. And I'm a career public servant. I grew up in a house of public servants. I personally feel, and this informs a lot of the way that I look at this legislation and even larger conversations related to reforms. I personally feel that we can and should hold every public servant to a really high standard. Certainly with Congress, There's a lot of challenges with Congress. I am leading a variety of pieces of legislation focused on getting Congress in order, ensuring that members of Congress can't be self-dealing, banning members of Congress from buying and selling and trading stock, because I think we should be held to the highest ethical standard possible, that people feel that they can trust us and that we're taking actions to ensure that people can trust us. And so I have zero qualms about saying that with other people in positions of trust, law enforcement, other public servants, that we have the right to expect the very best of the best to go into the fields of law enforcement and other public service. But we also need to make sure that our communities can recruit the best of the best and can pay the best of the best and can train, right? You don't just enter the career of law enforcement knowing how to de-escalate or knowing all of the laws and the provisions of how you keep your community safe, you uphold the law, right? Like, that takes a tremendous amount of training. And our communities don't always have the resources to put those investments in place. And so the COPS program is a federal grant program that localities across the country can apply to and can use these funds for investments in recruitment and training and vetting and the day-to-day experiences that will make their department the best in all that they want it to be. And be able to speak very strongly about, these are the investments we're making in people. These are the training programs we're putting our people through. And so the exciting thing about this bill is the program already exists. It's been successful for quite some time, but a lot more localities want to benefit from it. It was created back in 1994. And so our bill would reauthorize it for the next 10 years and nearly triple the funding. It also changes some of the formulary to the cost share so that smaller localities, again, I represent a mix of suburban and rural communities, but that smaller localities can more easily pay their cost share, because right now the kind of upfront cost can be prohibited. The cost share portion can be prohibitively expensive for smaller localities. And President Biden was in my district a couple weeks ago. He came for a visit, talk about prescription drugs. He met with a number of my constituents who have really interesting and in some cases heart-wrenching stories related to prescription drugs. But I got him alone for a little bit because I rode with him from the airport to the venue. And I talked to him about this bill. And I talked to him specifically about this bill because he's actually the creator of the COPS program, this grant program that's existed since back in 94. So I said, I know you are the father of this program that has been so successful and so helpful to localities across the country, but we need to have more of it. We need to authorize it into the future. We need to fund it at a much higher level. And we need to make some adjustments to the cost share so that smaller localities, some of the places that really need the support the most, can benefit from it. Yep. And so it's bipartisan. My colleague, Tom Rice, who's a Republican, from South Carolina, is leading it. We've been really trying to pull in additional co-sponsors. We're working on getting a version of it introduced in the Senate. There's a number of senators who are interested in it. So hopefully they'll move quickly on that side of it. But when we've seen kind of some of the budgetary shortfalls and the challenges that local governments are facing, when we see all of the expectations put on our local law enforcement, the idea that we could, provide them with the resources, through this grant program so that they can really do what needs to be done, and ensure that they're training and vetting the kind of the best of the best, that it's so foundational. And that's why I'm really excited about it.
Well, and it's programs like this that we absolutely need. I've been talking for quite some time about what I see as a looming crisis in law enforcement. And as a law enforcement officer, I think you can appreciate where we are. We find ourselves now, because of a lot of factors, that we're not finding those best and brightest wanting to step up to join this profession, because it just in many ways seems unstable. And we see this over and over and over again. If you're the best and the brightest, you've got an opportunity to work in a whole lot of fields. And if you got a servant heart, then obviously law enforcement and public service is someplace that's near and dear to you. But what we're finding across the country is our applicants are really off the charts. At the same time, we're seeing seasoned law enforcement officers that are leaving the profession at a much higher rate, which is creating a vacuum. And so, if we don't find a way to be able to address this, you talk about and what this bill does about recognizing those best and brightest, pulling them in, making it competitive, having communities reflect, the agencies reflect the communities. So what we're finding, across the country is that we're just not having the quality applicants of people that wanting to step up and take this job, and it's creating this vacuum that is putting us in a position where we need to. And a law enforcement officer yourself, I know you can appreciate this. You don't hire a person to become a law enforcement officer. There's certain skill sets that they traits they have to have. And then second, they have to be trained in a way to be able to use those skill sets, because as you point out, there's a certain amount of responsibility that comes with that because of the unique powers that are granted to law enforcement officers. So this journey from the time that we hire a person and get them to the point where they're effective officer is years.
Yeah.
So when you look at this, the disparity between the next wave of law enforcement, the best and brightest, the ones that are coming in that are going to be the ones to carry us, through the next generation. Well,
Yeah.
they're just not there, and so what we're finding is we have a manpower shortage that's creating two problems. One is a shortage, which that shortage is creating crime problems, and the second one is we need to take a look at the brave young and men and women who show up every day and do this job, and what it's putting on them, because they're working more hours, they're a lot more stress, all of these things. The well-being of an officer is just as equally as important as taking care of those that are there every day doing this job. We find ourselves in a tough spot. So this bill is it's bills like this that we need to look at and find innovative ways to be able to pull and attract those best and brightest into the next wave. I don't know if you have any more you want to add on that.
Well, I mean, I simply would say that, it becomes an issue of, like, what do we value as a community, right? I am of course very biased because I grew up in a law enforcement home. My dad was law enforcement. My mother was a nurse. Like, the helpers are the people who I think, we need to demonstrate that we value as a society: our firefighters, our police officers, our teachers, our nurses, right? The people who keep us healthy and keep our kids educated and keep our community safe. And really, there's been so much, and I've got a couple other pieces of legislation focused on, what are the metrics by which we should measure law enforcement and officers' success in their job, right? There's a lot of methodology. You can't just track arrests and, the number of people that people pull over, because you get into this place where, what are we incentivizing, right? And I think we should be able to have conversations about how do we, as you said, that, communities where a law enforcement officer works, or the communities that, that they're reflective of that community. But you look at some of the cost of living in some of the cities across the United States, and people can't afford to live in the communities that they are serving because the cost of living is so high. And so then what does that mean when if we're trying to focus on community policing and you don't live in a particular community, either because it might be too expensive and you're priced out, or because the department isn't necessarily, able to hire from the community based on, a whole host of other challenges. So, ensuring that there's more flexibility, that there's more federal support, because there will be ebbs and flows, right? And also, the bigger and kind of the stronger structurally a department gets, maybe a little bit less they'll need to depend on these federal grant programs, but they need to be there to support our communities, particularly at a time when we are saying, there's a lot of challenges facing law enforcement. We have seen great, like the horrors of when things can go wrong. We have seen what has happened when you maybe didn't have the right vetting, or somebody was on a department who shouldn't have been there, right? I mean, we have, as community members, I think the right and the privilege and the expectation of saying the people who are walking through our communities with a gun and a badge and the ability to stop you and potentially arrest you and potentially seize your belongings, like, they need to be well trained and well vetted and, like, well respected and paid for not just, the service that they render to the community, but frankly, the risks that they take. And certainly we've seen in New York City, like, the two young officers who I think it's just such a notable example, right? And it occurs across the country. But the two young officers who were responding to a domestic violence call, right? And I was a federal agent. I worked narcotics. I worked money laundering, some child exploitation, and I don't even begin to know what it's like when you just get a call that there's a domestic dispute. And you might walk into people arguing, or you might walk into somebody super angry with a firearm, right? And you don't know what it's going to be.
Okay.
And so the idea that those two young officers, the beginning of their careers, frankly, at the beginning of their adult lives, would have walked into a situation when they were trying to help someone who was in need because somebody called them, and like that, their lives are over. Or the FBI agents who our country lost in Florida 2 years ago when executing an arrest warrant on someone who was being arrested for child exploitation. And there they were protecting kids from sexual abuse, and they never went home, right? So ensuring that our law enforcement officers have what they need to do their jobs to stay safe, and that we can kind of ensure that we're in place as a society where we recognize the great risk that they take on our behalf, and that the communities that they serve, the communities in which we live, have the resources, through these federal grant dollars, to ensure the training, the vetting, and the retention of good quality officers who want to serve and kind of do that good work on behalf of their neighbors, friends, and family.
Yeah. If you look at it, and you're so correct, there are so many moving parts to the health of a community. And if you look at communities that are thriving, they have a very consistent model, and that consistent model is there are many moving parts, and all those moving parts are working in concert of each other, and that's what we really need to get back to. We look at crime and often blame law enforcement for it, but a lot of that has to do with a whole lot of factors that have nothing to do with law enforcement. We all have a part to play in society. We all have a part to play in government. And when we work in concert and together with each other, then we have healthy communities, and we need more and more of that. Thank you for your staunch support and giving voice to the many challenges that law enforcement faces. Your perspective from someone who's walked in those shoes is one that's very valuable in Congress, and it cannot be underscored just how appreciative we are of the hard work that you do. We're going to wrap this up. If you can give me, if there's anything else, I'll give you a chance to share any of your final thoughts on where we are in society and in law enforcement, and how we, working together, we can get past all of this.
Well, I think that as a society, as a community, and as an American people, I think we have a really important opportunity to have earnest, honest conversations about kind of the disconnect that exists between police, law enforcement communities, and the communities that they serve. I think that in the past couple of years, we've had really an extraordinary opportunity to talk about issues of justice and kind of policing reforms or policing betterment, right? And this gets back to some of the other things that I've mentioned. Like, I think that any person in a position of public trust should be held to the highest standard. And every law enforcement officer I have ever met has wanted to, aspire to be better and be good, and ensure that the people they serve know that they are there to help, to serve, and that they take extraordinary risks to do that. And so I think that over the past couple of years, we've had the opportunity to really open a dialogue in a way that I hope we can be thoughtful about making it really productive. I know that in the summer of 2020, there were quite a few marches and advocacy and Black Lives Matter protests or marches across the community that I represent. And in some of them, there were police officers walking right along with advocates and with community members, saying, like, we always want to do better and be better. In one particular community, there were sheriff's deputies handing water to people who were marching, and who spoke as part of the event to say, we are part of this community, we serve this community, and we're always looking to do right by people. And so I think that in many communities, particularly like the ones in Central Virginia that I represent, there's been a tremendous opportunity for people to communicate with how do we set the highest standard possible for the people who are serving our community and keeping us safe. And also recognize that the risks that a parent who's a police officer takes every single day, the worry that their children have, that their spouse have, like all of those things, everybody's experience is unique. And, I think that the pandemic has been such an uneasy time for so many people. And as we are getting out and about in more social, more normal ways, I do hope that we'll be able to have more opportunities to come together, that the law enforcement officers who are working in a community and doing work that is unseen, right, to keep people safe, to make sure that the festivals that hopefully we'll be having, we have a lot of food festivals and music festivals in my district, and that doesn't happen in a vacuum. It happens because there's law enforcement officers making sure that the traffic stopped and people are safe, and making sure that there's no threats to these big, wonderful events, right? Like all of these things in a community. And there's just such a place for us to recognize and celebrate that people serve different roles, and certainly those who choose to take on the role of protector, law enforcement, community public servant, that is a tough role that really can put strains on a family, put strains on a person. And through the support that we can give to these types of professions, to our local departments, and certainly my role as a federal legislator through federal funding, like that's how we can help create a foundation of support that is so necessary to kind of strengthening our community and strengthening the ties between people, regardless of what your job is, what your profession is, where you live, and all the rest. And, at times I think that maybe that's a little idealistic, but it's what I stick to, because I think that that's what we should all be pursuing and trying to achieve.
Well, I don't think it's idealistic. I think we all have, like you say, we all have roles we play in society and the things that we do. And really, at the end of the day, the most important of all of that is really the relationships we build around them. So when we build those relationships and we understand each other more as a person because of that relationship, then we find more and more ways to be able to mesh all this together. And really that's the health of a community. Those right. that are willing and committed to work together to find ways to better the lives of the people we serve. So again, thank you for what you do. The staunch supporter of important issues for law enforcement, and always appreciate your insight. So thank you for joining us today, and thank you to our viewers and our listeners. We appreciate you as well. This is an opportunity through the Blue View to talk about those issues that are very important to the men and women, some 800,000 of them across this country every day, who suit up and show up in communities across this country and make a difference in the lives of those people we serve. Thank you, and be safe.
Thank you.
Thanks for tuning into this week's episode of The Blue View, hosted by Patrick Yoes, National President of the Fraternal Order of Police. To catch our next episode, be sure to subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or anywhere else you get your podcasts. If you enjoyed this episode, please leave a rating and review. To get the latest from the National FOP, make sure to follow us on Twitter and Facebook at GLFOP and on Instagram at FOP National. Thanks again. We'll see you next time.